Okay, good morning, everyone. Today's class is from Dr. Roop. We know who is Dr. Roop, and he is a famous neurologist. But now he's working more with us in palliative care and working a lot as far as end of life care is concerned throughout the country. He's trying to develop this concept everywhere as far as possible. I know that he wants to develop this concept in neurologists a lot, although it is very difficult to make them understand, but he is a person who is an example for all the neurologists. And you can see that with the program, whole of the IAPC Academy program, you will find that only Dr. Roop is twice as a speaker. So this means that there is a huge need to understand that what exactly the palliative care concept should be, what exactly the need of palliative care in neurological disease. So last week we have understood about the basics of neurology and their need, and now we will go by, as far as I know that this today Dr. Roop will go by disease wise. So thank you, Dr. Roop, and thank you everyone for joining in the morning. Already 81 participants joined. I am expecting almost 134 for question and answer. You have to put your questions in the chat box. Today you will not find Anuja's voice. Dr. Arun will be taking care of your all the questions, and we will try to put all the question as far as possible to in front of Dr. Roop in the group. Otherwise, we will send it all the answers. Dr. Roop will give you your answers and send it to you, and your answers will reach to you. Thank you, Dr. Roop. Please, you can start.
Thank you, madam. It's always a pleasure to speak to all of you, and I have to thank madam for this concept, and Anuja and Nisha and others for putting it together, and for inviting me to speak again. Now, today I was asked to speak on neurological conditions needing palliative care. I've kind of stepped back a little and looked at how neurology and palliative care, the interface will work out. Then palliative care in patients with cerebrovascular uh, disease, strokes, and disorders of consciousness, and palliative care. Uh, Now, palliative care in patients with stroke is completely, the best I can say is that it is neglected. And yet, it's important to understand that stroke comprises 7% of medical admissions, 45% of neuro admissions. This was from a Bengaluru hospital study. And what was surprising to me when I actually had to review this topic for IJPC was that it is the most frequent cause of mortality in rural India. And to me, that was surprising. There's a concept called that we are in the age of receding pandemics. Of course, doesn't look like that. But Indian mortality statistics show that we are shifting over from infectious causes to non-infectious. And for various reasons in rural India, partly because of uncontrolled hypertension, stroke is the most frequent cause of mortality. The issues that come up in patients who have stroke are multiple. There's functional disability, there's a physical burden, which includes pain, not often recognized by neurologists, especially psychological needs. There's obviously socio-economic decline if the main breadwinner gets hit. Caregiver burden. There is unmet needs of counseling, spiritual distress, and end-of-life management. This is compounded by poor communications between patients, families, and doctors about palliative care and end-of-life care after stroke. Uh, Prognostic uncertainty is a given. I'm not going to show you the trajectories again, but remember that somebody who has stroke sharply declines in function, and then things can go on till a pretty prolonged future. And the surrogate is handle the responsibility of decision making, often indefinitely. For anybody who's interested, this is a pretty good review that came out in 2014. It is free on the net. And as I said, much of their recommendations are not, they don't have a very high quality of evidence, but that is the best we have. And it really depends on all of us to put more literature together. Okay. But today I'm going to focus on the on the front end of stroke in the acute setting and the most severely affected patients. And the long-term palliative care management of stroke, I think we will have to leave it for another day, but I've pointed you to the literature that you can find on it. So now, when you have somebody who develops any kind of neurocritical illness, there's a sharp decline in function. Some patients will die, some patients will end in a persistent vegetative state, and some will improve with disability. Probably the biggest marker of who reaches where is the state at admission. Okay, what are the therapies that we have? The immediate therapies we have are neuroprotection. Now, neuroprotection, uh, hypothermia has been used for hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, which means somebody who has cardiac arrest and is revived. And other options for other indications are still involved. We leave that. What about correction of the pathology? Uh, if it is a subarachnoid hemorrhage that is caused by an aneurysm, you can tackle the aneurysm, though that may not change the prognosis. Then one exciting change that has happened is revascularization for acute ischemic stroke. For about 20 years now, we have had intravenous thrombolysis, but it's only since about 4 or 5 years that uh, we have actually been able to attack the clot directly and to remove it. Now, this is an evolving technology. It works only during a fairly short time window, and the costs are substantial, really substantial. Um, are the benefits, well, for an individual, the benefit may be significant, but if you look at the system, the benefits are a little questionable. What about preventing secondary injury? So, in all these situations, in the acute setting, the most important problem is rising intracranial pressure. And probably the best and the one intervention that we have decent evidence for is something called a decompressive craniectomy. And we'll discuss that a little later. Okay, so I'm going to frame this in the setting of 3 patients. The first is this young woman, homemaker, mother of 2, who got a abrupt onset headache, declined in consciousness over the next few hours, and when she was admitted later in the day, was already literally comatose. So the next is this patient, much older, recently diagnosed hypertensive, came in with an intracerebral hemorrhage, and one look at this hemorrhage, and I'll talk about this a little later, and the prognosis was reasonably certain, at least to me, though not to the others. And this patient came in with acute onset of stroke, gradual loss of consciousness. Now, for those of you, we did a little bit of neuroanatomy last time. This is the brainstem and the pons. And here you can see this infarct that is yet evolving. And when he came in, we attempted to remove the clot in the basilar artery. This is the basilar artery. He had a very severe stroke, and the thrombectomy failed because technically it was pretty challenging, and it had already, I suppose, been stuck for too long. He stayed with us for almost 3 weeks, got a tracheostomy and a peg, went through recurrent episodes of nosocomial infection until his discharge. Now, the important thing to understand is that when somebody gets admitted in coma, and I'm talking of medical coma, put a traumatic coma aside, various causes of medical coma. And if you take somebody who is post 6 hours after admission, post 6 hours is because acutely reversible things like hypoglycemia and so on are already passed by that time, and you have somebody who has probably sustained severe CNS damage. Only about 10 to 15% of them will come out with mild or no disability. Severe disability to 10 to 15%. A small number will end up in this state that we call chronic disorders of consciousness, and a large number actually do not make it. When you see them right in the beginning, if these patients are totally comatose in the sense that brainstem reflexes are absent. So two of the following absent: corneal and pupillary and ocular vestibular reflex, the ice water calorics. If you take the whole cohort, death of vegetative state in almost all. If somebody has improved to the point of better than above and can also vocalize, maybe not well, but only on stimulation, then you're already looking at about 40% with either moderate disability or good recovery. And in between, you have all these. If anybody is interested, this paper, although it is 2001, was a very well done review of all the literature till then. And since this is stuff that is clinical, this effectively is timeless. I mean, I suppose we are going to be relying on this for a long time. And then what matters is how the patient fares during that admission. So if at admission, the outcome of death is about 60%, uh, obviously some of these patients will have passed away during the intervening period. And by the time you get to day 14, if somebody is still comatose, then the likelihood that they will remain in a persistent vegetative state is very high. A good recovery is pretty low. Whereas at admission, if you look at it, there is still that original figure that I told you of about 10% good recovery that is still there. So duration, there are other indicators also that this paper points out, and they're important to neurologists for prognostication. But as I said, typically palliative care would get involved a little later, but it's important for you people to be aware of how these decisions are made. Now, the initial prognosis is uncertain, and one of the problems is that there's something called a self-fulfilling prophecy, and this typically plays out in intracerebral hemorrhage to the point that early care limitation actually confounds prognosis when you use these codes, and this has been clearly shown. Neurosurgical salvage may be possible with the technique of the procedure of decompressive craniectomy, and this actually plays out most markedly in traumatic brain injury. Again, we are not dealing with that right now, but in traumatic brain injury, the problem has been that decompressive craniectomy, those people who survive are the percentage of people who have severe disability rises, even though when you do this, survival improves. So effectively, good results do not really change with this. We are all reaching this position that at least in the initial 24 to 72 hours, you must have a time-limited trial of full intensive care therapy. And this, I think, satisfies economics, ethics, and common sense. But towards the end of this period or even earlier, one of the questions that comes up is brain death determination and withdrawal with or without organ donation. Now, brain death certification, I'll cover this here because although this is not something that is in the purview of palliative care, but it's still something that you need to be aware of because of the way it plays out in our determination of death by neurologic criteria. So you need to have a very clear etiology identified, typically on a CT scan or MRI scan. There are clear exclusions because these are all conditions that can cause significant impairment of temporary impairment of brain function, and it's important not to make this diagnosis if any of these conditions is present. Now, one of the key points that we have in identifying brain death is the test called the apnea test. And the apnea test basically means that you stop the ventilator, confirm that the PCO2 has risen, and know that the patient is not taking a breath at all. And if this is confirmed, then you have effectively confirmed brainstem death. And given the situation that you have, which you have already identified by the CT scan, you can be reasonably sure that it is that the patient has in fact passed on. doing this test is the warning shot that really cut short all confusion. There has been some confusion about whether patients' families can refuse to have it performed. But this is a position that is evolving, not just here, but across the world, that is not so. It's a clinical test and does not require consent. It's important because if um, the apnea test and other uh, clear-cut diagnostic criteria are met according to the American Academy of Neurology's guidelines on determining brain death. There are no published reports of recovery of neurologic function. This is important because there's a lot of literature in the lay press in America about people who wake up after a diagnosis of brain death, and typically those are individuals who had traumatic brain injury and the AN criteria were not appropriately put. So you can understand that when a patient and family come through this, having advocated and gotten their patient through, well, neurologists and neurosurgeons saying that they should withdraw, you already set up an adversarial relationship um, between the treating team and the family. So that was not the case with this lady. She came in quickly. There was a she had a large aneurysm which was identified and quickly coiled. Given her age, they actually they did as well as they could, but there was no improvement, best management, and she was declared brain dead on day 3. And heart, liver, kidneys were harvested for donation. Um, the point that I was making a little earlier, that I was coming to a little earlier, and that is declaring brain death. Now, what if organ donation is not possible or is refused? Can you declare brain death and withdraw life-sustaining treatment? In the Aruna Shanbhag case and in the MCI Code of Conduct, a decriminalization of withdrawal of care when futility is recognized is clear. In fact, probably the only case, I mean, I'm talking in the terms of legal case that we know of, is a hospital which was fined 5 lakhs for keeping a brain dead individual on the ventilator. And this was a recent case. And I suppose you are aware that the Kerala government actually passed a GR which specified that if somebody is brain dead, they can be taken off life support. Now, this is important because what it all depends on is who is paying. In a private setup, if the family is paying, frankly, I doubt if many uh, neurologists or neurosurgeons would really push it beyond a point. But if it is a state paying, or if it is third party insurance that is paying, which is going to happen more and more often, we have to be sure that we don't get caught in between. Now, as I said, and this is a little bit of coincidence that really struck me. The government of Kerala put out this order. This was end of last year. And lo and behold, I mean, I was looking up the literature, and Dr. Pope is a pretty major authority on end of life care, medical legal issues. And he sent me this paper and then the review. Even in the US, this position has begun to evolve so that earlier, this question of whether consent is needed before a determination of death by neurologic criteria and providing guidance on how to respond to family objections, they are also evolving their standards. So this is something that is probably a worldwide movement, and you can expect some more changes over time. The thing is, and I'm just going to continue on this issue a little more before I move on, because this is where organ transplant and palliative care begin to overlap. What happens when death is not the question and this determination goes past the period when brain death can be determined? This is because of the entity that is called donation after cardiac death. Now, donation has to follow the dead donor rule. So, in patients where surrogates are in agreement on withdrawal, who have severe brain damage, preferably where this is covered by advanced care plan. This is an individual who actually has withdrawal performed in the OT with harvest team on standby. After the heart has stopped for a period of time that is deemed irreversible, organ harvest begins. Typically, kidneys come out in good condition, but the recent reports with specified anesthesia protocols, the boundaries have been extended even to heart donation. So, to know how this works and how this will work, say, when palliative care also has to get involved here, please read this, the Wakely Prize essay of last year, written by a neurologist from the US. It's a bit of reading for all of us. Now, in countries where obviously the whole end of life care paradigm and the culture has evolved, donation after cardiac death actually starts to pick up a bigger and bigger proportion of deceased donation. And you can see in the Netherlands, it has actually even crossed the figure for donation after brain death. So let's leave this point. What happens when death is not the question? And here now you're moving on to decision making when it's severe neurologic disability. So this lady, as I said, when I saw her, I actually suggested limitation of care. And the first neurosurgeon who came and agreed with me, the family was not sure. They asked for a second neurosurgical consultation, and the second one said, well, he shrugged and said, if they want it, we can do it. And as the husband put it, I want her back home. So she underwent a decompressive craniectomy, and the decompressive craniectomy means that you remove a huge skull flap. You don't touch the brain at all. You don't even cross the dura. So it's a huge skull flap that is removed. It's as big as the whole hand, and that is removed, and either it is kept in formalin or put inside a pocket in the anterior abdominal wall. It can be reused and put back later. Anyway, so this lady got that, and once you do that, then you allow the brain to expand and edema to take care, because what kills patients in the early period is the edema as it impinges on the brain stem. So if you do that, then the patient survives very often, but not without disability. And she got tracheostomy, PEG, both of them came out. And as the neurosurgeon said, well, this is a good result. So the problem is that when you're making these decisions in the acute situation, using our standard model, ethical model of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice needs to be contextualized. And this contextualization, the model that worldwide is now followed is the 4 boxes model. So I am again not going to stay on this for too long, but except to point out that this again is something that we need to read and perhaps discuss in various situations elsewhere. Okay, so for neurologists, the big issue which is perhaps, if palliative care is involved in the ICU, can probably be done better, is to handle substituted judgment. And substituted judgment, this was about 3 years ago, now 4 years ago, and I was not as up to the mark. I hope I'm better now, but at that time, I was not really able to explain that too well. So explaining substitute judgment, explaining that you are the patient's representative, that it is not your need, it is what the patient would have wanted that we want to hear, which is something that is a paradigm shift for families also. As they need to make that thinking change, you need to point that out to them. And then prognosis. Neurologists, neurosurgeons find it difficult to deliver prognosis, even though instinctively they often know it. And now what I do, at least in the acute setting, is if somebody who's severely neurologically impaired, I make this statement up front. I mean, I might use a wish, wonder, kind of statement here if there's talk of miracles and so on. But I'm usually fairly clear about making the statement that she will never be normal again. And then, of course, figures, numerical figures of what are the likelihood of being independent and so on. And why are these numerical figures important? Well, this was shown up by a paper that came out in the anesthesia literature. And this was a study where about 70 or 80 odd Australian anesthetists were asked. And they were shown these CT scans. They were given the clinical format and prognosis and traumatic brain injury. These were cases with traumatic brain injury. And this um, in these situations, there are, because of at least two large trials, the figures are extremely clear cut for unfavorable outcome versus good outcome. And they were asked to imagine themselves as the patient. Would you want a decompressive craniotomy for yourself? These were doctors. And you can see how the figures change after they were shown the numerical prediction. There's a substantial shift in everybody's judgment about doing a craniectomy or not. So you can understand that delivering prognosis in this situation needs this knowledge of prognosis. Now, I'm just going to quickly write a little bit on this. This is a problem that we have in physicians worldwide. We lost the skills of prognosis, and we are effectively socialized against prognostication. You see this in oncologists, you see neurologists, everywhere. This is because empowered patients now expect physicians to prognosticate in a fashion that is honest, accurate, and optimistic. And you know that with communication skills, we can almost manage to do that. But because most clinicians are not familiar with the procedure of communication skills, they replace it with what is called magical thinking and the ritualization of optimism. Sab theek ho jayega. So that's something that is a job for us. Anyway, so if anybody wishes to look at it, there is this recent paper, review article written by the doyen of neurointensive care, 5 principles of prognostication in coma. Now, he makes a point that patients can improve, though with significant abnormalities. Imaging and testing can help, but are rarely definitive. In the initial phase, secondary involvement of the upper brain stem. If you remember the picture of my lady with the massive hemorrhage, the brainstem was pressed because the hemorrhage was pressing on the brainstem. Once the upper brainstem is involved, the probability for an independent outcome drops sharply. And this, we do not need a CT scan. We can actually see this clinically also. We rarely predict mortality or diagnose brain death. Those are the extremes. But the main concern is anticipated neurologic deficits. And what people don't look at is prior comorbidity and other permanent organ dysfunction that are also critical factors to be taken into account before you make these decisions. And this review provides a fairly practical approach. And this conversation needs to begin when the neurologic prognosis becomes clear, latest by day 3 to 5. And perhaps Dr. Bhatnagar can add this because she has been working with her neurology department. I, for one, at Hinduja, Dr. Jayarajan has been getting involved in the with the ICU team. And it's important that palliative care needs to come in at least to provide backup support for this kind of shared decision making. Because this is what happened. Well, 3 years later, because she still follows up with me, the husband closed the consultancy down, stopped traveling, became a full-time carer, and they can afford it, 24-hour nursing. The patient is wheelchair bound. She's completely dependent. Now, this is left-sided paralysis, so she can speak. She's largely continent, and she can actually feed herself. But she's wheelchair bound, completely dependent. And this is what she said. And this is what the husband told me. I think this was somewhere towards last year. The patient is not very happy. And I've treated her for depression, but she has not changed her opinion on what her situation is. And the husband obviously is, you can see caregiver distress here. So we have to have a due process for foregoing life-sustaining treatment. And uh, I should have changed this slide and add the AIMS document here. Basically, we confirm consensus amongst the treating team, go on to involve the surrogate decision maker, confirm hierarchy and consensus. And it's important to remember that the AIMS document has finally spelled out a hierarchy, and then document this. Now, there is this issue, and it's partly legal, it's partly uh, emotional, which I'll come to a little later. Just mind this. Now, these conversations typically should occur in about, they take, families take some time to process this kind of information. And my feeling is that this needs to be done over a period of week to 2 weeks. Typically, when the tracheostomy has to be planned, this leads to a fork in the road, which will lead to reassessment, either support in the hope of improvement or de-escalation to palliative care. And we need to provide details. We need to take the family through this decision making. Um, Typically, both neurosurgeons and intensivists want to put in a tracheostomy and move the patient out of the ICU. Mera kaam khatam. So it's something that we have to be, and that is the reason why I think that palliative care needs to start getting involved upfront. Why is this important? This is because withholding and withdrawal are medically, ethically, and legally equivalent. But to the layperson, withholding is emotionally easier. And I would like to put it down that even the Supreme Court has seemed to look at it in the same way. So when we are withdrawing life-sustaining treatment, we are extubating them, but we are not withdrawing. We are framing this problem as a withholding of tracheostomy. And when you do it that way, families find it easier to accept. So there are, I mean, I can pass on papers on palliative extubation. There's at least one paper out from, I think, from Taiwan. And again, we need the palliative care team involved when this is to be done, because symptomatic management is their business. And once the patient is moved out, then the patient is, at least in my care, Dr. Jayarajan is, or Dr. Rajamaiya are involved in management. So the third patient came in with very severe, as I said, stroke. And when does this kind of situation reach stability? With traumatic brain injury, young individuals, we would extend this period to up to almost 12 months. And that is the reason why early predictions in traumatic brain injury in young individuals are tricky. But with non-traumatic coma, I'm reasonably certain by the end of 2 weeks, I would say I would be about survival or not. About significant disability, I will be certain by the end of 2 weeks. About survival by about 4 weeks. So by about 3 months, we are in a stable state. So most patients, almost all, do not stay in coma. Coma doesn't last beyond a month, and then they enter one of these 4 states. The persistent vegetative state, eyes open, the patient has intact brainstem function, so breathing is possible. They obviously won't stay on the ventilator, and they are even able to, so the family sometimes gets a little confused whether they are tracking movements or not. But if they have clear fixation of gaze and they follow simple commands, you then know that this is a minimally conscious state. And then, of course, you have significant impairment where functional use of objects and functional communication begins up to the point of becoming normal. So you identify 2 clear states, persistent vegetative and the minimally conscious state. Now, why are these important to distinguish? Because these were not conditions that we were really aware of till about 20 or 25 years ago, but now we are. In the vegetative state, you will get patterned or involuntary movements, you will get startle, you'll get random non-contingent vocalization also. So the patient will make, but there is, it's not dependent on stimulation. Here, the vocalization of the response is contingent on stimulation. It's intelligible. Eye movements are fixated, and they may be unpatterned, but there is often localization to pain. Obviously, communication is not totally reliable, and all of this is as opposed to coma where you have reflex posturing and the eyes are closed. So this state ends by about 4 weeks and they move into one of these two states. Now, do they stay in? I'll leave this for anybody who's interested. As I said, you all have the option of writing to me and getting this presentation. So there are all these details about how you make these decisions about these states. But probably the best way to systematically keep an assessment is the coma recovery scale. This does require a neurologist to be involved, but it's not a very complicated scale. And as you keep it, you can follow these patients up numerically over a period of time. This is the CRS for my patient, and by the time he was discharged, transferred to a small hospital close to his residence, the total bill was, I think, just under 10 lakhs. And this, after we had tried and helped with all kinds of concessions and so on. Now, the thing is that at this stage, the tracheostomy and PEG was placed at 19 days. Typically, we do, if we are planning a tracheostomy, then we usually don't delay this beyond about 2 weeks, though up to 3 weeks is acceptable. Why did we pull it to 19 days? Because of the caregiver. And one specific caregiver, the patient's wife, refused to let go. Although her whole family was in agreement with the treating team that we should withdraw, she refused, and we finally ended up discharging him. I have been trying to find out if he survived, but this was a little while ago, and during the pandemic, we really have known this. Now, it's important to know that the caregiver experience and support, that this experience is grossly influenced by communication during the acute phase. And that prognostic uncertainty makes that the main caregiver make an explicit commitment to continued care, often against opposition. Hence, carrying that burden of advocacy goes forward, and this can go on for a long period of time. Again, both patient and caregivers are likely to be younger, so there's unlikely to be any prior statement of what the patient would want. And over a period of time, the caregiver burden is way higher than even advanced cancer or dementia. And this is a kind of ambiguous loss where the loved one is physically present but psychologically absent. If anybody is interested, this paper is on is free, which looked at how it's a qualitative study of how this works out. So for us as palliative care professionals, if you are supporting them, you need to explicitly recognize their commitment, counsel them, but yes, you have to stay the course with them. Now, what happens to these patients once they entered this stage? If somebody is clearly, and this was a study that looked at patients at 90 days, and then again at the end of 6 months to see how much they had improved. Now, the GOSE score is functional outcomes, and GOSE 4 is somebody who is capable of being left alone for 8 hours at home, but is otherwise still completely, well, not, I mean, is obviously not independent in that sense. Now, if somebody is in the vegetative state, or what is now called the persistent, the wakefulness syndrome, is likely to not improve beyond this point. Whereas somebody who has advanced to the minimally conscious state, they have some chance of coming up beyond that. So it's important to make this distinction between the vegetative state and the minimally conscious state, at least in terms of this bit of prognosis. But as I said, most of these who make this transition are in traumatic coma. So for somebody like my patient, I would expect that if he was here, he would stay here. There is another issue that comes up, and that is that as technology has advanced and as we have been doing something called functional MRI and specific quantitative EEGs and so on, you actually can find out individuals who are awake inside and clinically are in either minimally conscious or persistent vegetative state. This is because of a disconnection between the cortex and lower structures, and you can imagine what a terrible state it must be. Um, but the best estimate is that probably not more than 10% of them are in this state. And my own feeling is that, again, this is specifically only for young individuals with traumatic brain injury. So, when you are managing somebody in chronic disorders of consciousness, goals of care are to accurately assess the level of consciousness, address reversible issues, see if there are any pharmacological treatments possible, go on to do medical and rehabilitation procedures, and provide the context of care here. Uh, there are specialized disorders of care programs available in Europe. Uh, this publication came out from a unit in Italy, and they have seen that the basic rehab that is essential is passive joint mobilization and making the patient upright with a tilt table at least once a day. That is the only one for which there is clear evidence. Interventions, limited evidence like adaptive technology, provision of interaction communication, all kinds of specialized treatment concepts have not really been shown to have any evidence. There are pharmacological agents that people use to, they're both CNS stimulants and GABA agonists that have been used. The CNS stimulants are logical, but GABA agonism, especially with zolpidem, this turned up about 20 years ago, that it did show some improvement in uh, some patients. So all patients with disorders of consciousness nowadays get this trial of this drug called zolpidem. But I think the figures for benefits are pretty small. Neurostimulation uh, with non-invasive and invasive means are possible. Repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation is an easy process to use, but there are obviously complex ethical issues regarding decision making, because these are patients who are not going to improve functionally. They may improve in consciousness, but that's it. The main issue for us is detecting and managing pain in these patients. And here you need to use uh, nociceptive coma scale. There are others also. There's PAINAD, which has been used in dementia. And these use motor responses, some verbal responses, and facial responses to pain. And this is especially needed if you are doing potentially painful interventions. It could be even something as simple as physiotherapy for this patient. So this needs to be assessed and followed. And you can imagine that in a unit or in somebody who's managing these patients, unless somebody from palliative care is involved, there may not be too much attention to this. Another uh, feature that happens is the paroxysmal sympathetic hyperactivity syndrome. This seems to occur with pain, but can also occur intermittently, spontaneously. It's a sympathetic storm with simultaneous paroxysmal increase in sympathetic and motor activity. Occurs at all stages of brain injury, can cause weight loss, and may even need opioids for management. Eventually, for long-term management, you will need to use baclofen, bromocriptine, and benzodiazepine. So again, something that needs a neurologist to help you. But you also need to start discussing, uh, having serious conversation with these uh, patients' families. And as you can imagine, acute medical illness, hospitalization, reintubation, change of peg tube, uh, distress in the caregivers, all of these, I mean, these are discussions that should happen at regular intervals, maybe every 3 to 6 months. Now, as I said, um, part of the problem is that we are not involved with these patients. And it is only when we start getting involved that this will happen. What happens elsewhere? Now, this probably has been best developed in the United Kingdom, because that's what I'm reasonably aware of. And in the United Kingdom, they have something called the Court of Protection. It's a bench of the High Court, which specifically deals with issues of severe disability, patients who need to be placed under, say, the court's protection. This is because obviously theirs is a, because of the NHS, care is completely paid for by the government. To some extent, between families and the treating team, you will have issues coming up. And that is why the Court of Protection works there. In India, as of now, it really is he who pays the piper calls the tune. So they will take up people who are sustained interminably on clinically assisted nutrition and hydration and work their way through actually withdrawal of this. And as you realize that the withdrawal processes for assisted nutrition and hydration are prolonged, this requires effectively palliative sedation, and in individuals it can take up to 2 weeks for the whole process to be completed. These decisions have to come before the courts. This may be changing for the persistent vegetative state. In the UK, it has now been stated that if somebody is clearly in the persistent vegetative state, it does not need to come before the court. But when it comes to the minimally conscious state, because now you have bigger issues of personhood coming up, it still needs to be addressed in court hearings. And if anybody is interested, this is the publication from the unit that handles chronic disorders of consciousness there, about how they handle these decisions. Sorry, I think I've repeated this. I'm going to just drop this because this was a poem that was written and was placed as part of that paper. So when you have somebody who has, this applies broadly to anybody who has serious acute brain injury. There are multiple points where decisions have to be made. The first in the initial period is neurosurgical intervention, then comes brain death determination. And this, from this point on, is where the palliative care needs to be involved. This is when tracheostomy and PEG needs to be placed, where you need to decide about palliative extubation and then going on to the long-term management of these patients. And here is where I believe that palliative care strengths really make sense, because every patient, family, and situation is unique. And too often neurologists and neurosurgeons feel that they have to apply the same models everywhere, which doesn't work. That commitment to shared decision making, supporting the family surrogates through the process, minimize their sense of guilt and withdrawal, and respect their commitment if they wish to continue. All of that has to be tied together with the ethical and legal framework, and you need communication skills to take you through this. Now, the last segment of my talk now, you will have seen that I believe that there is a natural alliance between neurology and palliative care. But I'm actually going to see if I can put numbers onto it. I'm not going to list the various conditions. If anybody is interested, there is an ebook. It's been shared by my colleague Benzi Kluger. If anybody is interested, I'm happy to send you across the PDF, because he's sent it for anybody who's interested. I remember Arun speaking at the IPC conference in Guwahati about looking forward to what career opportunities are there for people who are in training as palliative care physicians. I think that my analogy is looking at, say, where neurology was about 40 years ago. And at that time, the separation between general medicine and neurology had not really completely happened, at least in India. And it was that there was that question mark. And now we not only have neurologists, we have subspecialties in neurology, and so on. So if I look at the medium term, uh, jobs for future palliative care physicians, yes, with oncology, that is the defined pathway. With hospices, and as they expand, yes, that is also there. But please look at this job opportunity that I think will come up more and more often. And of course, you have community palliative care and home care teams. Those also will keep expanding. But this job opportunity is something that needs to be explored, and Dr. Bhatnagar will be able to explain that better to you because of the position that she holds in the All India Institute. But I think there is some experience that is now coming out from our own hospital with Dr. Jayarajan's work in the with the ICU and other departments. All of us know that symptom burden, whether it is cancer or non-cancer, once somebody requires is at a stage of severe or advanced disease, the symptom burden probably is not too different. But what about the numbers? And this was a surprising paper that I ran into some time ago. I think this is the only such paper that I have been able to see so far. This looked at home-based palliative care, the experience from one unit in Mallapuram. And when they started, this was cancer, 90%. Today, cancer is just about 30%. And if you look at how much is neurology, actually neurology is more than cancer. Of course, if you look at their diagnoses are obviously, I don't think there were neurologists involved. But if a neurologist were to look very carefully at this, I'm sure that the neurologic symptom burden would definitely cross 50% in this lot. So, I've said this earlier, I'm going to say this again. Today, palliative care physicians, well, the bulk of the work is oncology focused, whether it is in hospitals, whether it is charitable NGOs. This is because traditionally, and as it evolved, cancer patients had voice. And cancer patients, more typically in the trajectories, the Niagara Falls trajectory of cancer, means that the patient, the budget, and the commitment of whoever is providing this are limited, and they all, sorry to put it that way, all expire together. But if you look at these needs when they arise from within a hospital setting, when they arise from government supported initiatives, when they arise from the community, they will recognize broader needs, and they will recognize suffering. They are not concerned about medical specialties. From Anil Paleri, I have this figure that, and that's when I said the symptom burden of more than 50%. He feels that more than 50% of their community patients, the burden is neuro-related. And with neurology, the patient is voiceless. The commitment tends to be indefinite. But just because palliative care has gotten very comfortable here, I don't think that is okay. We need to move together and move into this space. This was again another paper that came out from my friend Janice Miyazaki in Canada. And she did this quantitative study about how neurologists and palliative care can work together. Neurologists are more likely to refer patients if they work in interdisciplinary settings and have positive experience with palliative care. Less likely to refer because they fear a loss of autonomy in patient care, unaware of available programs, and more importantly, they believe that they do a good job themselves. So we have very clear jobs to do. I'm going to stop at this point. As like last time, you're welcome to email me, and I'm happy to share this presentation. Thank you.
Oftentimes, it happens that people look at palliative care as demeaningly as, okay, fine, we have nothing to do. Let us step down to palliative care. Rather, why not put it as an empowering word rather than saying de-escalation to palliative care? Why can't it be so more empowering as why don't we involve or enhance palliative care in order to improve your quality of life? It's just about semantics. That's what I wanted to
Uh,
put forth.
Madam wants to, I'm happy to answer that. And this is an
Yes,
issue
sir.
that comes up across the world. So you can always say that what is in a name, and why not just call it supportive care for the time being until the you can call it the negativity or whatever it is wins, and then we are well. There's no finally at the end we are what we are. We do what we do. So at some point, I partly do agree with that. But finally, the barrier is not with the patients. The barrier is with the clinicians. If the clinicians understand, accept, and finally, how does it matter? If I am geared to palliative care, my work begins, and I, in that sense, I'm the generalist in palliative care. I provide the transition point to specialist palliative care as and when I need to. But then for neurology patients, this is my responsibility and this is what I should be doing. So for us, the bigger challenge is to get neurologists involved. And once we have that, and this, of course, will work out across specialties, uh, more important than that is to have palliative care physicians in place in hospitals where they can interact with other specialties.
So, sir, there are some questions about terminologies. Like Dr.
Yeah.
Nandini asked about locked-in syndrome. Then Neha Singh also asked about stupor, coma, locked-in syndrome, whether they come under the umbrella term of CDOC. So, can you please
Okay.
say something on that?
So, okay, sorry, I kind of skipped over all of that. Stupor is obviously only in the initial period. You would take it as somebody who has, if you remember the first few slides that I showed, somebody who is able to vocalize is in significantly altered consciousness, but is on stimulation is able to vocalize. You would call them as being in stupor. It's not a term that we often use nowadays because it's not very well quantified. Locked-in syndrome is the possible situation that my patient with the brainstem stroke could have had, except that when we checked very carefully, he was not awake inside. So you have individuals who it is possible to determine are awake inside because their paralysis starts just below the level of the oculomotor nuclei. So they have typically lesions in the pons, and because the pons controls horizontal eye movements, they have lost horizontal eye movements, and yet uh, at a period of time, because this is something that even the clinical team often takes some time to pick up, you realize that the patient can communicate by eye blinks and vertical eye movements. And this obviously is a person who's still awake inside. So here, the ethical questions completely change. And that's the reason why we don't include them, because then they would basically need full rehabilitation and perhaps palliative care, but they don't come into the category of CDOC. These are individuals who can express their own wishes.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a next question. Is there a protocol to manage acute stroke in the home care setting if the family members agree to do so in a very elderly patient rather than going to a big hospital? Any comments on that, sir?
Sure. I mean, if home care can come in and manage them, there is absolutely no issue about that. The protocol is basically in somebody, depending on prognosis. The question is whether you will or will not use um, a feeding tube, or if you will use it, how long will you use it for? So that is about the main decision making. Obviously, I mean, the first decision making is whether you take the patient to hospital or not. If you do move them to hospital, do you move them into the ICU or not? And if you don't, then do you put in a feeding tube or not? So these are, I don't think these are set protocols. We call these heuristic decisions. Heuristic decisions are decisions that have to be made, are contextualized decisions, and they will depend on an individual. So no, there will be no algorithm for these decisions because they will change from patient to patient.
Okay, thank you. So next question. Early palliative care is the key it says, but how early would you like to get involved in a neurological disorder, particularly where the trajectory is unpredictable?
Yeah, so this is an example that is evolving. I am not sure what the experience is elsewhere, but this is something that will apply to every healthcare setting and will have to be evolved individually. But I believe that the role for the palliative care physician actually is on rounds with the ICU team. Maybe not every day, but 2 or 3 times a week. It's important for the palliative care physician to be there to nudge them into making these decisions at an initial stage and to put his or her perspective. And that is something that we will need to evolve. Now, that will happen only when you have boots on the ground, when you have people to do that. So as palliative care physicians get appointed, that is a role that I see coming up.
And apart from the ICU, sir, I think there is some role in dementia and other disorders as well.
Yeah, obviously. That then overlaps with home care.
Yeah, thank you. I think people have got a lot of question about terminologies.
No. So again, I'll come back to that. So if somebody is in coma, that is when the brainstem is not functioning too well. Over a period of time, the brainstem begins to wake up. If breathing does not come back or it is not adequate, then it is impossible to sustain that patient indefinitely without a ventilator, and most people will withdraw. But that is extremely rare. Typically, by the end of the month, by the end of about 4 weeks, spontaneous breathing does come back. And once spontaneous breathing comes back, other functions of the brainstem also start to pick up. If they pick up to the point where the person has some eye movements, but no other responses whatsoever, roving eye movements and spontaneous breathing, you then have somebody who is in the persistent vegetative state. Okay. If it goes above the level of the persistent vegetative state and there is some amount of interaction with the environment, which is contingent, meaning you call the person and the person looks, you give a command and the person tries to follow that command. When you have contingent responses, then you call it a minimally conscious state. In the persistent vegetative state, there is no contingent response. The response is random.
Okay.
I think time is over, but if you think that there are if there is a repetition, I can see the questions are almost repetition. And we can send this whole of the chat box to Dr. Roop, and Dr. Roop will send the answers to Nisha, and Nisha will convey this to everyone, because I think its time is over. And I just want to share just 2 minutes I will take that how we have integrated palliative care in neurology and AIIMS. You know, first time when I offered that we can do something in neurology, I think everybody was having a strange look, and they were very shocked at how palliative care will be integrated in neurology. Then they have we started making end of life care policy, and I involved neurologists, famous neurologists of the world in this policy. Then they started appreciating, and she was the most she was the person who has really appreciated a lot that this is an important document which has been made for the AIIMS. So she has started sending me consultation, and now it's not that we are getting everyday consultation, but our residents are going every day. They have a monthly posting, so they are there and they make a lot of difference, and they are there on the rounds, on the ward rounds, they are there at the ICU rounds, and when they pick up the patient, it's not that somebody will listen to JR when they are going on the rounds, but if they talk some sense, and everybody listen them that they are talking some sensible thing. But as Dr. Roop has said that after 1 month, 2 months, 2-3 days we should start, it will never, it does not happen. Neurologists will send you a consultation when they are fed up with 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year. So a patient is in ICU for 6 months, patient is in ICU for 3 months, then they will, but definitely things are improving. It is not discouraging at all. It was a tough journey, but once you will involve yourself, once you will prove yourself that whatever you're talking is sense and you are making a difference in their patient care, people are going to listen you, because ultimately they are also very intelligent people and they want to do some benefit for the patient. And once you will start creating a sense of satisfaction and confidence in them, everybody is going to listen to you. And I am not saying that we have created a perfect system, but definitely we are on the verge of creating a perfect system. How long it will take, I cannot say again, but definitely our residents, they are like a kid. Just after finishing MBBS, just after doing 1 year MD in our own department, we sent them to neurology, and they really make a difference. When they talk to the senior most person, they listen to them, and I think I am proud of them. And this is the way we have to create a difference. And once even if in 1 year, if a neurologist will call you to create a difference or to call for a palliative care consultation, I am telling you, please do your 100%. If you will do a consultation, if you will talk to once to the family members or a neurologist and come back, it will not going to make a difference. You have to follow up your patients. You have to 100% assure them that whatever you have done is till the end, you have done everything. Then they will start believing you. It is a tough journey. And Dr. Roop, I am very happy that you have given a very good, bright message at the end to our palliative care physicians that there is a bright future in neuro palliative care also. So imagine in all the medical colleges, neurology department is 100% there. If even a single seat of neuro palliative care physician will be there in the neurology department, automatically the problem will get solved. Because we all know that stroke is a problem, coma is a problem, unnecessary patients are in ICU is a problem, and most of the ICU beds in neurology are unnecessary, filled up with the comatose patient. And I think you have given a very excellent presentation, Dr. Roop, and I am very happy that you have given a very good message to my JRs and all other MDs all over country, those who are listening this lecture, and the young male palliative care physician. Thank you very much, Dr. Roop.
Thank you, madam.